Hans Van Tilburg is the author of Chinese Junks on the Pacific, a study of 10 particular junks and their stories and their journeys to the US and elsewhere. Offering more than just history, his work focuses on Chinese junks such as Wang Ho, Ningpo, Amoy, Free China, and others, whose histories tell a story about the East, the West, and the seafaring vessels that travel between them.
That's interesting. I mean, well, the cultural history of what happened in China, of course, is pretty difficult history. Um, what they've been through in modernization and the Cultural Revolution and the whole period where everything old was, seen as a mark of the imperial way of life and had to be destroyed and modernized. And I'm not saying various versions of that didn't happen elsewhere as well in the world, but yeah, I think there's an awareness that there weren't a lot left of some of these original designs. And in fact, when the United Nations, environmental and scientific and cultural organization nominated the technology of traditional junk construction to its safeguarding list, it was really focused on some of the hull elements, but I think there was an understanding that, yeah, there are only a few people left that actually can build these rigs, these vessels left, and they should be, noted and valued. So when I was in school, becoming, obsessed with maritime history in my academic career years ago, I loved that attempt at the global perspective, world maritime history. What was that? And at that time, it seemed to me that there were a lot of really big texts that were 90% the story of the European sailing vessel, which is a fascinating story from Northern Europe and elements of the Indian Ocean, etc. And then kind of at the end, a chapter or a few pages on Asian designs. Now, granted, that's not to knock, what it meant when armed galleons emerged from Spain and Portugal and had an impact on the world. Of course they did, and that shaped our evolution of the modern vessel today. But just in sheer quantity and centuries and millennia of maritime activity, what happened in Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia, all of the designs, the regional designs, you're right, that has been overshadowed, to say the least. And so I think there are a few places now, and I think more experts these days that are taking a look at that in history and in archaeology, trying to recover. An accident of my various careers, I think. For one thing, I grew up sailing with my dad in California. He had a 30-foot sloop, and so I had a physical familiarity with the ocean, and loved that in my relationship with him. That was wonderful. And I fell into the field of maritime archaeology and history sort of accidentally. I was a carpenter in San Francisco, and as a lark, I kind of found this field school in maritime archaeology. I thought, what the heck is that? And just kind of signed up. And then I needed a master's thesis topic, and was searching around. And then I think the third thing is that on my mother's side of the family, that's the Chinese side of the family, I did have an appreciation for some of that heritage. And so I remember when I was looking at historical documents, I came across an image of a Chinese sailor leading a giraffe onto the deck of a sailing junk in the 15th century, and the story of Zheng He and the admiral of the Ming Dynasty. And I thought, what the heck is that? I had never really heard of that. And so that kind of opened the topic to me, and I became fascinated with, exactly as you put it, what is a little understood topic, certainly in the West, but has the scope of centuries, if not millennia, and some really fascinating periods of history, and the vessel design and the rigs themselves. Quite fascinating. Limitation of my abilities with the Chinese language, but I also think just the difficulty of this field. It's somewhat peripheral history in the 19th century, given the attitudes towards migration, immigrants, certainly the attitudes towards China in the later 19th century in the US, and the exclusion law that was passed. And, those were the only ones that were really the most accessible. I know that there are a few others that are, but the documentation on them is really difficult to track down because, I think that these voyages were not legal in a lot of circumstances. Certainly talking with people in California, descendants of Chinese families on the coast, fishing families, some of whom arrived on junks, they have an intriguing story of a group of three or so, came and, shipwrecked in the Monterey area or things like that. But there's very little documentation of that. So those 10 were the ones that I could find enough public reaction to in the media to be able to do some sort of analysis with. But it is a limited number, a limited sample size. So certainly the study isn't, really comprehensive from a technical aspect. I think you'd want more of a sample size to really say something definitive technically. But ethnographically, they're representative of this kind of phenomenon. There's a really intriguing image in what used to be a moving panorama scroll. In the 19th century, there was a craze for these moving panoramas, these hand-cranked moving pictures. And there was one made for the gold rush in California, and circa 1853. And this was a 270-foot long hand-painted scroll that they would hand crank and narrate, and there would be some music. It would show scenes of ships going around the Horn, arriving in various ports and cities of California, mid-19th century. And the depiction, the recreation of that scroll, because it's been destroyed, it's been lost, shows a Chinese junk in San Francisco Bay, circa 1853. So there's no way to be sure if that's accurate because the original is gone, but it's very intriguing, certainly. There is, I have a sense that there were some that were, pretty traditional working designs. I mean, certainly things like the Free China, which crossed in 1955. I mean, those group of sailors in Taiwan, they found that vessel on the mainland coast, and it was a working commercial vessel. It was, hauling fish cargoes and possibly smuggling cargoes as well. I don't know. But yeah, those were not, built for the export trade or built specifically on spec for exhibits. And you're right, some of the small number of 10 were kind of commissioned for purposes. And I think even in the late 19th, certainly early 20th centuries, there was enough of an interest where there were junk designs, certainly in the 1950s and 60s, where there's kind of an export style of Southern Chinese junk that's more of a, kind of a recreational yacht style and not like a working traditional vessel. So some, I think, are more representative than others from that perspective. Reasonable. Given if you don't encounter any major Pacific storms, crossing in the northern latitudes, with the prevailing winds is, like all sailors would say, sailing's, 90%, boredom with 10% terror. So, if it's not an eventful crossing, that's a good thing. There are all kinds of vessels that have drifted across, intentionally or otherwise. There's flotsam and jetsam that comes across the natural circulation of the North Pacific. The phenomenon of junks from Japan, which became drifters, was quite noted in the 19th century. that by imperial decree, by law in Japan, they didn't want the sailors making seaworthy vessels. They wanted to keep everyone in the closed country. You weren't supposed to go abroad. It was illegal. So when these poor sailors were disabled at sea from a coastal storm, they would drift across the Pacific. And there was an academician named Brooks who wrote a report in, I think it was 1860, about these drifting Japanese junks. And he documented maybe 60 of them being encountered by steam vessels. And one of them is even kind of washed ashore near Oahu. And it was in the 1830s, actually, that one had been blown off the coast of Japan, had 4 survivors on board, very famished condition, was sighted near Wailua, the north shore of Oahu, came ashore, and they were towing it back down to the south shore, and it wrecked at Barber's Point, unfortunately. But so even if people didn't mean to, there were sailors that survived the Trans-Pacific voyage and ended up on the West Coast. So it's very possible, whether it's a large, complex sailing junk or just a smaller coastal fishing craft, it's possible to cross that very large ocean. That's a wonderful story. Those drifters were kind of imported by shipwrights and fishermen. When Hawaii opened itself to immigration from Japan for labor, shipwrights, fishermen began to come over, and they were building what was a traditional Japanese design, a Yamagata style small fishing sampan. Sampan's one of those odd words too. I mean, that's kind of a Chinese derived word for small skiff. We just kind of use it generically. But what came across originally, I think about 1899, were these small sailing sampans for fishing. And those began to be built in Honolulu, in the territory of Hawaii. And there are images of them, lining the docks, quite picturesque, quaint, single-masted. And soon enough, after 1900, 1910, 1920s, these vessels are being motorized. Gasoline engines, then diesel engines. So they become kind of a hybrid, very high bowed, very, very tall prow, diesel, motorized, long-range commercial fishing vessel for the tuna industry. And there were hundreds of them in the Hawaiian Islands. So a hybrid by that stage, but certainly originally a traditional Japanese sailing fishing vessel. Interesting question, because I was kind of poking around in my notes and sources about that. I'm not an expert in the field, and I'll tell you that in general, maritime archaeologists are not proficient in rigs. We usually just see lower hull pieces, right, and cargo. We don't get to see the rigging and the mast, not too often. So, you guys are the experts there. But I have my depictions that I've seen in the sources I have, and one of them is actually more recent. In 2015, a fellow by the name of Douglas Brooks published a book called Japanese Wooden Boat Building. And he's from Seattle, Washington. He's active in wooden boat building, and he's, a specialist. He went to Japan and studied with traditional shipwrights. Wonderful depictions of modern constructions of traditional Japanese junks, but also historic representations. And those look like very tall, square-rigged vessels, certainly. And I've seen a depiction of these smaller sampans with the same kind of tall mast and what we would say is a square sail. But I've got to say, it's kind of canted, and maybe it's not even what part is to the starboard, what part's to the port. So I'm not sure, and I simply don't know where the line is between, a lug rigged gaff sail and a square sail. I mean, obviously there's a whole continuum, or Well, I mean, it's a very heavy vessel, a heavy wooden vessel. It's certainly nothing like my childhood of fiberglass sloops and small lasers and dinghies. But it had a very nice, gentle, slow roll and motion, and certainly handled very decently, I thought. Fair to say. I think it's also because they're the ones telling their stories, and so those stories are the ones captured in the media, and so there's a record of them. I think if you have a sailor whose lifetime passion is to cross the Pacific in a junk, but he's not the extrovert entrepreneur. Maybe it's harder to find that documentation, certainly. I think that's very fair. I think that's very fair for the birth of the tourism industry and heritage as tourism. Because sometimes those things had to be created and kind of sold. This was a for-profit kind of exhibition itself, right? So you have to attract people to come down to the beach or the harbor for the day, or come to the exhibition and hear these stories. So yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that type of interest, certainly. Um, but it can detract from the serious interest in the technical evolution of these very interesting vessels. A couple. One is the Free China, the one that crossed in 1955 and ended up in California for quite a while, kind of knocking around. Because I got to help a bit in the preservation and in the documentation of that one, and that's one of the rare preservation success stories because the vessel is now on display in Taiwan. Granted, it's difficult to maintain a wooden vessel of that age, in the water or up on land, and she's up on land now, and they face challenges. But that's a wonderful story, and the small, though I would say the small family style fishing junk that was built on Hainan Island for an American museum and then imported and put on display in Portland is a wonderful small vessel. She doesn't have a name. She's just, the junk from Beihai on Hainan Island. Um, but the owner, Guy LaSalle, still has her sailing. And, she's a lovingly crafted teak, single family, live on board vessel, an accurate representation of what the boat people, the water people would have had for a small family, along with the rig, the sails, the tools used to build her. The whole kit is intact and together, and so that's wonderful. And he's maintained her over time. He's had junk rates come over and help him with that. He's getting to the age now where he's beginning to think of, ultimately she's going to have to find a home elsewhere. And so where can she go? To maybe a museum would be interested in making that commitment and taking her on. But I think, that small junk in Portland is also a favorite. It's an excellent question. And I think you're right. Some of them obviously would not have found it so exotic. They would have been more familiar with seeing these types of things. Um, there is a lot of regional variation, though, in the styles that cross the Pacific, and of course that were working the China coast. And a lot of the fishermen in the California fishing camps were from the Pearl River Delta area. So they were building one particular style, which would have been familiar for a lot of the migrants coming from that area. My mother's family are from the Pearl River Delta area. They would have been familiar with that style. But you're right, for people in the marine industry at the time, I guess, late 19th century, sure. Or anyone in the fisheries, would probably say, oh yeah, those things are kind of familiar. Not so much for the general public. But you're right. Certainly for some people, they would be more familiar. Certainly. Or Asian influence is pretty early. I mean, let's not forget the Manila galleon trade, encountering New Spain and Monterey down to Acapulco, are sailing with Spanish, but also Chamorro people from Guam, Mestizo and Filipino sailors, from the islands and others. I mean, I think, it might be fair to generalize that vessels and crews can be quite a mixed lot very early on. Sailors being pretty transitory, and so there are Asians in New Spain, no question about that. Maybe the Monterey area, but certainly Baja and Acapulco. Question, because the focus on these galleons, these treasure galleons, for a long time was just the cargoes, and they're of a sufficient age. If we're looking at the Pacific and what Spain had created, their navigators, we're talking 1567 through 1815. So quite a long period for those handful of galleons. A lot of them are built in the Philippines. I think some were built in New Spain. Maybe looking more galleon-like than not, but we don't exactly have the plans. And at that time, building vessels was kind of an art and a skill kind of passed down and by a guild, or it's not the scientific pursuit it is today with hydrodynamics and computer design, certainly. So the question of what these actually looked like is still very much under discussion by maritime archaeologists and historians, these specific galleons.
The Junk Rig Association is the place to go for information, assistance, and the Fellowship of Junk Rig Sailors. Our website is at www.junkrigassociation.org. We hope to see you there.